Hi everyone, I'm Mohana. I'm an artist and illustrator specializing in floral and botanical illustrations. I enjoy working with a lot of different subjects and mediums and have hosted over 150 private classes and workshops on these topics. To find more of my work, you can find me at Art of Misanthropy across all social media. Now, let's get into today's tutorial. I will be working with this watercolor sketchbook from Ayush Paper. It's their 100% cotton 270 GSM watercolor paper, and as you can see, the texture is wonderful. It's very textured, which means you can add a lot of character and variety to your artworks, and you can really use this surface to your advantage. Because paper matters to me, I always use Ayush Paper. I'm going to use this half sheet, but you can use any size that you like. I will also be using this well-loved watercolor palette as well as these water brushes. You can just use regular paint brushes, but I felt like using these because I haven't used them in years and they're also really convenient. Lastly, I'll be using these fine liners from Sakura. For more information on the products that I'm using, check the description box below. Now, as you would have seen from the title of the video, we are working on some loose watercolor flowers today. And the first thing I'm going to do is load up my brush with a lot of water and paint and then just create these dots in a roughly sort of circular pattern or circular manner, and from there I'm just going to use the tip of my brush to drag those dots to create these shapes. These shapes will be our petals, and as you can see, they're very simple, very common petal shapes. They're just tapered at either end and wide in the middle, and I'm just going to go around and create more of those petals. If your dots don't have enough water, don't worry about it, that's fine. Just load up your brush with more paint and more water as you see fit, and just keep dragging the paint from one end to the other, creating those tapered shapes, and just add more color and water wherever necessary, wherever you feel like it, and create as many petals as you like. Now I'm just going back to the center and adding just a little bit of a darker shade. I'm using some reds and oranges just to give my petals more depth and more variety, and let the colors play amongst each other, play with each other, and create these wonderful textures and patterns that I was talking about earlier. With watercolor, always remember to let the paint do its thing, let the water do its thing. Don't try to fight it, don't try to control it too much. Obviously, you want to assert some amount of control, but just focus on having fun and let the paints sort of seep into one another. And as you can see, now I'm just going ahead and creating a second flower in that same manner, following those same steps that I did before. And I'm overlapping them a little bit. If you want, you can leave gaps in between, but I like an overlapped sort of interesting look for my illustration, especially for an illustration like this one. Now onto our third flower. I've already added those dots, this time in a redder shade. I've already used a few oranges, and I'm now trying to introduce some variety and just introducing some, more fall colors to go with that sort of orangey autumnal palette. Just remember to keep dragging your brush and creating those petal shapes. Wherever the shapes are not to my liking, I'm just adding more detail to them or lengthening them or changing up the shape slightly. And you can do the same. Just make sure you're playing around with the shapes a little bit, and definitely playing around with the colors and using the texture of the paper to your advantage. I'm letting all those orangish and reddish tones sort of play with each other. I'm letting them bleed into one another, creating those gorgeous watercolor bleeds. And to every flower, I'm sort of adding a darker color in the center just to introduce more variety as well as contrast and depth. Moving on to another flower, I'm following those same steps and just changing up the colors and tones a little bit as I go along. Remember, just experiment, have fun with the medium, have fun with the surface and the texture, and add as many or as few petals as you like. In this manner, I'm just going to keep adding flowers all over the page, just sort of overlapping some of them and repeating the same steps, and just creating this very vibrant, very fall themed, orangish, reddish toned artwork. You can obviously create this painting using any color palette of your choice. Feel free to use whatever colors and shades and tones you like, but I just personally really love these autumnal tones, and I think it's perfect for this time of year. And I'm just adding the last few flowers to the edges and corners of this sheet of paper just to make sure it's nice and full. Once our flowers are done and ready and those first few layers are completely dry, I'm going to just go ahead with a darker color. Here I'm using sort of a maroonish brownish tone and adding these dotted details to the center of my flower. This is just to again add more contrast, more depth, and to add a little more detail to my flowers. In keeping with this color palette, I've just mixed up this shade using a couple of reds and maroons and just with a hint of green in there just to mute the shade a little bit and sort of get it to look a little brownish. And now it's time for our final step. I'm just adding these curved lines coming out from the center of each flower using this fine liner. I don't want to distract from those vibrant shades and tones, and I don't want to take away from the texture of the paper. So I'm just using these lines to enhance and add just the tiniest bit of detail to each flower, but I'm not letting them overpower the flowers. For that reason, I'm using this size 01 tip, but you can go ahead and use something even smaller or slightly wider and thicker if you like, depending on what sort of line art you want for your specific piece. There is no restriction and there are no hard and fast rules about this, so please feel free to follow your usual style or go with whatever kind of pens and whatever thicknesses and fine liner tips that you generally like to use. You can even use ballpoint pens or gel pens for this particular step and it will give you the same results. The main thing to remember here is that you keep your lines curved and make sure that they're not straight, make sure they're curved in keeping with the shapes and curves of your petals. That is just going to lend more cohesion to your artwork and it's going to make sure that everything fits in together nicely. I'm just going to go around and add those lines to each of my petals and every single one of my flowers, making sure to maintain that dainty, delicate look of the flowers and of those lines. And just going ahead and adding those final few lines to my last few flowers, and that is it. Our autumn themed loose watercolor and ink floral artwork is done. Don't forget to tag Art of Misanthropy and Ayush Paper if you recreate this piece, and subscribe to Ayush Paper for more such tutorials.